Hello and welcome to another edition of Bible Time. This is the Friday edition, and we are continuing in the book of Esther today. We're going to chapters 3 and 4, and I really appreciated and was greatly encouraged by all the comments that were left yesterday, of all the testimonies of God's providence working in your lives. It's an amazing thing. I mean, you think about miracles that God has done, and when you realize He's all powerful, unlimited power. Sure, parting the Red Sea, God can do that. We get that. But I think that His providence, His working in the day-to-day events of life, what do we got? Billions of people on this planet, and they're all making decisions, all doing things, and yet God is orchestrating all of that all the time so that His purposes are being fulfilled exactly and precisely on His timetable. That to me is more mind-blowing actually than parting the Red Sea. And yet that's what goes on. That's what's going on right now. God is working in His providence to fulfill His plans for His glory and for the good of His people. And that's an important thing for us to remember. And this book of Esther illustrates that perfectly. I mean, it tells a story. It's a true story. And the story, as the story develops, you see God's providential work here in these events. And chapter 3 introduces us to the villain of the story, a man named Haman. And we're told right off the bat that he's an Agagite, which means he's a descendant of Agag, who was a king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites Amalek was the grandson of Esau. That's where they come from, the Amalekites. The Amalekites attacked Israel as Israel was going through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And because of that, God pronounced a curse on the Amalekites, and He told Saul in 1 Samuel 15 to eliminate the Amalekites. You remember, though, that he didn't do that. He didn't eliminate them, and one of the persons he kept alive was Agag the king. And you might remember what Samuel did after Samuel confronted Saul and his sin and told him that the kingdom was being taken away from him. He hacked Agag to bits. But the descendant of Agag apparently survived, and now you've got this man Haman the Agagite. Now you understand why it was important that we be told that Mordecai was a Benjamite, because Saul was a Benjamite. And so there's been this ancient feud between the descendants of Benjamin and the descendants of Agag, and here it is in our story. Now, the events here in chapter 3 take place maybe 5 years after the events of the first two chapters, and Haman gets all upset because Mordecai isn't bowing down to him when he goes in and out of the palace. And the idea here of the bowing down, and if you understand the culture there and the religion there, that's an act of worship being shown towards Haman. Well, Mordecai's not doing that, and Haman recognizes that Mordecai's response as a Jew is symptomatic of the Jewish mindset that they're not going to bow down to the leadership, and he perceives that as a serious threat to Haman's authority. And so Haman's plan is, I'm just going to eliminate all these Jews. And here you see where Haman, he's more than just the bad guy in the story. He's a tool of Satan, doing Satan's plan, trying to eliminate the people of God, eliminate the people of the Messiah. He's always at work to do that. And Haman now is his most current tool in this point in the scripture. And he gets approval for that without even telling the king who the people are that he wants to eliminate. And he sets this plan in motion, and Mordecai becomes aware of it, and Esther becomes aware that Mordecai is upset about something. The messages are sent back and forth, and she finds out what it's all about. And Mordecai says, "Hey, you got to talk to the king about this. So you're the queen. You got to talk." And she says, she tries to get out of it by saying, nobody can go in unless the king gives the okay, and he hasn't seen me for 30 days. So I don't know how that's going to work. And if you go in without his permission, you get killed. So I don't know that I can really help. Well, Mordecai's response here is one of the most classic statements in all of the Bible. It's here in chapter 4. It starts in verse 13. Let me just read this for you. It says, "Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. I mean, all the Jews are going to be killed, and that will include you. You're afraid of getting killed by the king? Hey, you're going to get killed. And he says, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Well, what a great statement that is. I mean, he recognizes God's faithfulness and sovereignty and says, hey, if you're not going to do anything and be a part of this deliverance for the Jewish people, God will raise up somebody else, because God's made a promise to Abraham. He's going to keep his promise, and God has the power to fulfill his promises. So, you have a choice, Esther. Either you can be a part of this, or God will raise up help some other way. That's a great statement of his confidence in the sovereignty of God. And he recognizes too the providence of God, because he makes that great statement to Esther about who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. It seems like God has put you in this place at this time for this purpose, and you need to recognize his providence at work here in this situation. Well, after that, Esther responds and says, okay, I'll do it, but here's the deal. You got to get everybody together for 3 days of fasting, and implied in that is prayer and fasting for 3 days, demonstrating trust in God, dependence on God. We got to look to God. God's got to do something here, or nothing's going to happen. And so you're seeing a trust in God's faithfulness and his sovereignty, a recognition of God's providence, a dependence and a trust on God. And then at the end of it all, Esther makes one of the great statements in all the Bible. This is a statement I usually make when I'm about to eat something that I'm not sure about. I just say, well, if I perish, I perish. Well, she says it in a much more serious context. She demonstrates boldness, she demonstrates faith, she demonstrates courage, and says, I will do this thing, Mordecai, and if I perish, I perish. I mean, she's committed to doing what's the right thing, and if it costs her life in the process, then that's what it'll be. So this is the way it is. I mean, this is the way it is when you really believe in the sovereignty of God, and you trust his promises, and you recognize his providence, and you depend upon him, and you act in faith. This is a great lesson right here, and no doubt that's what this is here for. Not only to encourage the Jewish people to see God's providential protection of them through this threat of annihilation, but also to show us how it is to walk in faith in a God who providentially is overseeing all the affairs of this world. What a great way to end our week. What a great way to end on a Friday. And I trust that this will give you more to think about over the weekend, and to let it sink into your heart. And if you want to leave some more comments right below here too, with more thoughts on God's providence in your life or in this world, lay them down. That would be a great encouragement to all of us. So I trust you'll have a great weekend, and we'll see you Monday for more Bible time.